we've covered last year is when can we legitimately modify tradition, with a subtitle of Waging War on Shabbat. Now, this waging war on Shabbat, I have to say, comes with, as I often do, perfect Torah timing and Jewish communal timing. Torah timing because this coming Shabbat we read Parshat Emor, and it's probably one of the most well-read parshiot in the Torah because it lists the entire cycle of the calendar year, but it begins with the most important part, which is Shabbat. As to do with the Jewish calendar observance, we know, especially in this past year of pandemic, I repeat what I wrote in my letter that went out to the congregation from Achad Ha'am. More than Shabbat, more than Jews have kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jews. And I've had many people reflect to me that those that attend services, that when one day seems so much like the next over these past 14 months, Shabbat is something we look forward to and helps us organize our week. So tonight, in a couple minutes, we're going to hear a short video from Rabbi Eliezer Diamond, and we're going to study a number of texts. We most likely take it for granted today that warfare is permitted on Shabbat and holidays. Absolutely. But the fact is, this hasn't always been the case. This actual issue was the subject of intense debate at a crucial moment in Jewish history, one that we celebrate. It's probably the most celebrated time outside of Passover, Hanukkah, the case of the Maccabean revolt. And while we celebrate the Maccabees on Hanukkah for succeeding in defeating Antiochus, the Maccabees were not the only Jewish group to take up arms. The Hasidians, from the Hebrew word Hasidim, pious ones, a small sect, had actually been early resistors to the Syrian Greeks, but the enemy seized on a crucial weakness. The Hasidians refused to desecrate Shabbat by waging war, and therefore, we know, were decimated in a series of brutal massacres. Now, in contrast, the story that we know, Mattathias and his followers, actually at the time, it's not something we learn about when we study Hanukkah, they made a radical decision to break from normative practice and to engage in defensive warfare on Shabbat when they were attacked. Now, it might be tempting, especially in modern times, to write off those who considered martyrdom over armed resistance as fanatics, whose view is not worthy of serious consideration or relevance by those many in the Jewish community who only have a limited commitment to Shabbat observance. And yet, I would argue that this debate is central to thinking about the process of legal change in Judaism. And it actually offers us an opportunity to open frank discussions about the relationship between halakha, Jewish law, what's in the Bible, how it evolved, and community. And while the stakes may be very different today, as a Jewish community, we continue, if not more than ever before, about questions of national survival, debating how we best ensure a strong and a vibrant Jewish future for the, in particular, our concern, the North American Jewish community. So in a moment, we're going to listen to the video and study some of these texts. I'd like you to think as we do that, the existential about perhaps what you see as the existential challenges facing Jews today and the accompanying calls for innovation or adherence to tradition. When can one consider oneself empowered to modify, to set aside tradition? What are the legitimate means of doing so? How does innovation come to be seen as consistent with tradition rather than an act of abandonment or betrayal? We, most likely, those of you here tonight, take it for granted that we can interact creatively with tradition, at least to some degree. But are there any principles or values that should remain inviolable? When do concessions to exigencies change the nature of Judaism so significantly as to render it unrecognizable? So let's watch the video. I thank Valerie for running this for us this evening. Got to back it up a little bit. That's it. That's fine.
October 6th, 1973, the armies of Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack against the state of Israel. This date was not chosen casually. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, a day on which it was assumed Israel would be entirely unprepared to respond militarily. Ironically, in the end, this worked to the Israelis' advantage. Significant numbers of Israeli soldiers were gathered in synagogues and were therefore easier to call up, and the roads were virtually empty, facilitating relatively quick and efficient deployment of troops and material. No soldier, no matter how punctilious in his or her religious observance, hesitated to take whatever actions were necessary to repel the invaders, including many actions that under normal circumstances would be unthinkable because they would constitute a blatant violation of Yom Kippur's sanctity. In other words, it was clear to all that the survival of the state and its citizens was of supreme value, not only existentially, but religiously as well, setting aside all of Yom Kippur's religious imperatives. Nothing surprises us about this behavior. We all take it for granted that Judaism places the value of life above the sanctity of Shabbat and festivals. What might indeed surprise us is that for centuries, the opposite was true. It was a given that even when threatened militarily, Jews were expected to give up their lives rather than profane Shabbat. It was only during the late Second Temple period, in the midst of the Maccabean revolt, that a dissenting view was expressed and embraced. Even after the revolt, the issue continued to be debated. It took several centuries before a consensus emerged, allowing any action necessary to ensure individual or national survival on Shabbat and other holy days. The idea that the sanctity of Shabbat should take precedence over preserving human life might seem counterintuitive, but we can understand it better if we consider the centrality of Shabbat to Jewish life. Shabbat observance is the only ritual obligation mentioned in the Ten Commandments. Even before the revelation at Sinai, God commands the Israelites to treat Shabbat as a holy day by not cooking, baking, or gathering manna. The sanctity of Shabbat is emphasized in connection with the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the desert. Despite the importance of the Mishkan's construction, the obligation to rest on Shabbat takes precedence. Later, at the end of the First Temple period and the beginning of the Second Temple era, Shabbat observance was at the heart of a struggle between the residents of Jerusalem and their religious leaders. Both Jeremiah and Nehemiah speak of commercial activity taking place on Shabbat within Jerusalem's walls. Jeremiah prophesies that the continued violation of Shabbat will result in Jerusalem's destruction by fire. Nehemiah responds to Shabbat violation by closing the city gates before Shabbat every Friday. In light of these positions, we can understand that it was far from obvious to our ancestors that there were any circumstances under which Shabbat observance could be set aside. The initial decision to fight on Shabbat was the result of a crisis faced by the Maccabees and their allies. As guerrilla warriors, they took refuge in a network of caves in the Judean desert. Antiochus's soldiers discovered their location. Knowing that the Jews would not defend themselves if attacked on Shabbat, the Seleucid army chose to launch its offensive on that holy day. As a result, untold numbers of Jewish fighters lost their lives as they remained passive in the face of the Syrian assault. Mattathias, seeing this, concluded that it was not God's will that the Jewish people be decimated because of their devotion to Shabbat. Henceforth, he declared, he and his men would defend themselves against all military threats arising on Shabbat. His view was not uncontested. Looking at passages from the second book of Maccabees, the works of Josephus, and Talmudic teachings, we can trace resistance to Mattathias's dispensation and, at the same time, a gradual broadening of the right to engage in warfare on Shabbat, eventually allowing offensive as well as defensive military action on Shabbat. Mattathias did not claim to have prophetic powers. He did not expect direct divine guidance in making his decision, so he couldn't know whether or not he was acting in accordance with God's will by allowing defensive military action on Shabbat. He was left with the burden of deciding the issue based on his own understanding of Torah and the needs of the Jewish people. We might imagine a number of questions crossing Mattathias's mind as he considered the appropriate course of action. When can one consider oneself empowered to modify or set aside tradition? What are legitimate means of doing so? How and when is it possible to see one's innovation as consistent with tradition rather than an act of abandonment or betrayal? How is one to decide whether changing Jewish practice will have positive or negative consequences for future generations? When we study the ancient texts addressing the question of warfare on Shabbat, we find that these questions were taken up by advocates on both sides of the issue. Each side invoked theological and existential concerns, and each side warned of the unintended negative consequences that they believed would result if their adversary's view was adopted. The larger questions raised in the debate about warfare on Shabbat remain relevant in contemporary times. In the mid-20th century, when the conservative movement debated whether to allow congregants to drive to synagogue on Shabbat, Shabbat observance was central to questions of communal identity and sustainability. Would allowing people to drive to services on Shabbat strengthen Jewish life, as proponents of the change hoped, by enabling more participation? Or would it weaken Jewish life, as its opponents feared, by discouraging Jews from living near each other and maintaining a Shabbat community? The majority of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards voted to allow people to drive to Shabbat services, yet the debate continued. Was the process by which the decision was reached and therefore the decision itself consistent with halakha and with protocols of halachic decision-making? And, in hindsight, was Jewish communal life strengthened or weakened by the change? More recently, in 2006, after years of debate, the Law Committee issued a responsum allowing gay and lesbian Jews to lead partnered lives in dignity, even if not all sex acts were permitted. This responsum took an approach of working within the parameters of the halachic system, but some members felt it went too far, even quitting the Law Committee in protest, while others felt it didn't go far enough and demanded a wholesale rejection of any prohibitions around homosexuality. Today, the Jewish community faces an even broader existential challenge around intermarriage. Would permitting such marriages constitute an irreparable break with Jewish tradition? Or could it be seen as a legitimate expression of that tradition? Would it help preserve Jewish life in America? Or would it weaken it? Considering a parallel struggle from long ago may help us as we strive to find the right balance between tradition and change.
Okay. So when many of you took from a couple of years ago the first series from JTS called The Ethical Life, we studied some of the core principles, values that exist in Judaism, and highlighted how often one can be pitted against the other and what kinds of compromises need to be made. Clearly, there are two major values here in the text that we're going to study: the critical nature of Shabbat and what Shabbat has meant, and the observance of Shabbat that I mentioned, appears as a center part of the Torah, as he said, the only holiday to appear in the Aseret HaDvarim, the Ten Commandments, and that of Pikuach Nefesh, aspects of saving a life. And if I were to have asked you prior to watching this video, which value is preeminent today in Jewish life, you had almost to a person, I'm sure, would have said Pikuach Nefesh. We all know saving a life, Pikuach Nefesh, is above all else. Ultimately, it's why even in Israel and in other places here in Baltimore, there are doctors who are Orthodox who work in the hospital on Shabbat because their role, they may make some modifications on how they get there, et cetera, but Pikuach Nefesh is preeminent. So the underlying question to the text, and we're going to spend some time when we finish them, is that do we as Jews need to change for Judaism to survive? Or will Jews and Judaism only survive if we hold faithful to tradition? How do we determine whether changes in our personal and communal Jewish practices and policies will lead to a rejuvenation of Jewish life or potentially put its future at peril? So this study of a past struggle to balance the sanctity of life with the sanctity of Shabbat is an opportunity to think through the question of who or what principles are of the greatest importance to us. So let's go to the text, which Valerie will be putting in a moment up on the screen. Text number 1. Going to be studying parts of 3 biblical texts that relate to Shabbat. Okay. So first one will be very familiar. Do we have mute your screens unless you're reading, please, or Somebody's dog is barking. Do we have someone that would volunteer to read this? Now, as we're reading this text that we're almost all familiar with, I'm sure, ask yourself, what in these few short verses needs interpretation? You know, we have the Torah in front of us about Shabbat, but what needs some kind of interpretation? So we have someone that wants to read?
I'll read.
Okay, Mona.
Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, or your cattle, or the stranger who is within your settlements. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and sea, and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it.
Okay, thank you. So what in this needs interpretation?
Definition of work and labor.
Exactly. Yes.
Also,
So,
Lakadesh.
okay, good. You got them right away. So the first one is in the Hebrew, it's the third line down, right? The asita kol milachtecha, right? You shall not do any milacha. You shall not do, and it's translated here as work. That's an unfortunate translation. Many people translate it as such. That's really not what Shabbat is all about. Shabbat is all about refraining from activities that would cause us to create in general. So let me just make sure, please make sure your screens are muted. It is refraining from not work.
Creative work.
Some people say, oh,
Creation.
the rabbi works pretty hard on Shabbat, right? And they had a workaround for that. How can a rabbi get a salary when you had contemporary rabbis? And the answer was the rabbis paid for all the preparation that takes place in order to run the service, but not for running the service itself. David, did you have something to say? David Braitman, I thought you had, oh, you didn't. Okay.
No, sorry.
Okay. So
Charlie,
what? Sharon, you need to mute. Okay. So we need some interpretation of what that means, right? And then the last one where it says, right, and we know that line, that last line in Hebrew, because it's the line we say right before we say the Kiddush on Shabbat morning, Al Kain Beirach Adonai et Yom HaShabbat Vayikadshehu. The Lord blessed the Sabbath day, Beirach, he blessed Shabbat, and he made it Kadosh, he hallowed it. We don't have many other aspects of Judaism that it says God blessed it and hallowed it, both. Okay, so let's go to the second text. This is a simple one. Someone want to read it? Short? Okay, Edie. I may not see everybody raising your hands, but I did see you, Edie, because there are more people than screens with the text. Go ahead. You have to unmute yourself. You have to unmute your screen.
Okay, it's Henry.
Why we have
Mark
all over.
Mark that the Lord.
Right?
You told me last week.
Yeah.
on.
I'm sorry.
No, you
I got it. Okay. Okay. Mark that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, he gives you 2 days' food on the 6th day. Let everyone remain where he is. Let no one leave his place on the 7th day.
Okay, so we get a little bit of a hint there about what malacha means, what you're supposed to be doing, not much there. But he gives us 2 days food on the 6th day. What was it? What was the 2 days food that they're referring to?
Friday night and Saturday.
Right, but it says God gives
The
us 2 days food on the 6th day?
It was the manna.
Anna.
Exactly. Very good. So it was the manna where we got a double portion when we were wandering in the desert. And therefore, we didn't have to do anything related to cooking or wheat or anything else. Of course, we were only fed by manna anyway. And just as an aside, I'm sure many of you know that's the reason why we have, I mean, there's lots of reasons. It's one of the reasons why we have 2 chalot at all of our meals on Shabbat,
Right.
representing the manna in the desert.
Right, exactly.
So, and then it says, let everyone remain where he is. No one leave his place, which again leaves all kinds of questions open of what that means. Okay. You can create your own relevance. I don't want to spend the time on it on, what does this have to do with warfare on Shabbat? But clearly one was meant to be at home and not doing anything that would cause them, if they can't even do food, then ala chad kama v'chama, all the more so warfare. All right, let's look at the third text. Someone want to read for me the first paragraph? Now this is already in Deuteronomy, chapter 20.
When you
Volunteers?
take the field against your enemies and see horses and chariots, forces larger than yours, have no fear for them. For the Lord your God, who brought you from the land of Egypt, is with you. Before you join battle, the priest shall come forward and address the troops. He shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, you are about to join battle with your enemy. Let not your courage falter. Do not be in fear or in panic or in dread of them. For it is the Lord your God who marches with you to do battle for you against your enemy, to bring you victory.
Now, I'm just going to quickly summarize the next paragraph, right? It's all talking about worrying that someone will die in battle. So if you built a new house or you planted a vineyard or you became engaged, go back to make sure that no one was frightened in a sense. So one of the questions that arises to me, because this is talking about, right, what is the thing that we learn from here when the Israelites, what are they told? When they go to battle, right, they should have no fear, not just not fear of their enemy, but actually not even a fear of dying. Why?
Because God is with him.
God is with you. When God tells you to do something, right, including observing Shabbat, then God will battle for you against your enemy to bring you victory. God will battle for you against your animal to bring you victory. So don't be afraid to die.
Yeah, Rabbi,
right?
Rabbi, I have a
Go ahead.
question though. But if you are in battle and somebody next to you dies and you're told God will protect you, what happens to you psychologically at that point?
Okay, well, so that would beg the question, how do you think that the Israelite soldiers understood this promise that God was with them, even though they acknowledged and knew, they weren't naive, that they might die in battle?
Right.
What do you think they might have thought?
Well, this 23rd Psalm would come to mind.
Okay, right. I mean, ultimately that God is with us. So, that leads to interpretations of Olam Haba. And I can't help but see, and I don't want to go in that direction because there are too many other things we have to talk, but, I think of in Islam, Allah Akbar, right? That God is with me. I go into battle, even with suicide bombers, but going into battle, there's that strong belief that I might die and I'm willing to die for those principles I believe in because Allah is with me. Parallels, God is with me. Okay, so let's go to text 4 that's on the screen here. Next one. Okay. Now, this is from the book of Jubilees. Many of us probably have not had exposure to that. Actually, the earliest mention of a prohibition against waging war on Shabbat is in the book of Jubilees, which was a 2nd century BCE apocryphal book, reporting to be an account of what was revealed to Moses in the 40 days on Mount Sinai, written 2,100 years ago, and adopted as not, obviously it's not in the Tanakh, it actually was adopted into the canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, has 50 chapters like Genesis, and was read regularly by Beta Yisrael, the Ethiopian Jews that were brought to Israel. So this is going to help us flush out a little bit the question of what malacha is. What does it mean to sanctify Shabbat, and what does malacha work entail? Because the Torah doesn't tell us. So between the time of the Torah and 2,100 years ago when this was written, this was the understanding then 2,100 years ago. Please remember that was before we had the rabbinic Judaism, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the things we know of today in our traditions. So who wants to read?
I'll read. And behold, the commandment of the Sabbaths that I have written for you, and all of the judgment of his laws. 6 days will you work, but the 7th day is the Shabbat of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work on it, you or your children, or your manservant, or your maidservant, or any of your cattle, or the stranger who is with you. And let
Stop there. Just stop there for a second. That was pretty much verbatim from the first text that we read. Right? Okay, now this is what's added on in the Book of Jubilees.
And let the man who does anything on it die. Every man who will profane this day, and whoever draws water on it, which was not prepared for him on the 6th day, and whoever lifts up anything that he will carry to, I can't see that next word, so to take out of his tent or from his house, let him die. And any man who does work on it, or who goes on a journey, or who plows a field either at home or at any other place, or who kindles a fire, or who rides on any animal, or who travels in the sea in a boat, and any man who slaughters or kills anything, or who slashes the throat of cattle or bird, or who snares any beast or bird or fish, whoever fasts or makes war on the day of the Sabbath, let the man who does any of these things on the day of the Sabbath die.
Wow.
How about milking the cows or whatever animals?
Back then, the answer would have been no here, right? There's a lot of things in here that we would look at, right? Whoever lifts anything to take out of his tent or from his house, let him die. So eventually, what did Judaism do? They created the rabbinic construct of the
Eruv.
Eruv. So for a lot of these things, we know that Shabbat was interpreted, at least. By the way, I think this is fascinating, especially giving you the background that Beta Yisrael, that Ethiopian Jewry, this was a book that they read because it was a part of the Ethiopian community. Why does that make sense? Because they never had rabbinic extensions of all this about Shabbat. So what did Ethiopians do on Shabbat?
Nothing.
They didn't have a Shabbat goy, so to speak, to keep them warm or to light turn on their electricity or light their candles or cook for them. They literally observed the biblical Shabbat. Okay, so let's go to section 5. Section 5.
Marcia.
Section 5 is from Josephus in his book Against Apion. My pronunciation is probably going to be bad, and I'll ask Michael for you to pronounce something in a minute, right? But this is a text, right, that is telling a story, and then Josephus is going to give his own opinion of this. Josephus, as you see, was a historian in the 1st and 2nd century, wrote the Jewish War, Jewish Antiquities. We learn a lot about what was going on somewhat after the fact from Josephus. So let's go to that text. And,
I'll read it.
okay,
I'll read it.
okay, Rachel.
Wait. Excuse my Greek pronunciation.
That's what I said. Michael could probably tell us how it's pronounced, right?
Yeah, I can do it in Greek too.
Oh yeah, that's right. God, I should know that one. Yeah.
These quotes a tale told about us, the Jews. The following are his words. The people known as Jews who inhabit the most strongly fortified of cities, called by the natives Jerusalem, have a custom of abstaining from work every seventh day. On those occasions, they neither bear arms nor take any agricultural operations in hand, nor engage in any other form of public service, but pray with outstretched hands in the temples until the evening. Consequently, because the inhabitants, instead of protecting their city, persevered in their folly, Ptolemy, son of Legos, was allowed to enter with his army. The country was thus given over to a cruel master, and the defect of a practice enjoined by law was exposed. Agardethides finds such conduct ridiculous. Dispassionate critics will consider it a grand and highly meritorious fact that there are men who consistently care more for the observance of their laws and for their religion than for their own lives and their country's fate.
That's also 2nd century BCE. And how does Josephus's view differ from this writer? His opinion is, 3 lines from the bottom. You pronounce it much better than I could. Arcides finds. What is Josephus trying to say?
That it's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
No, that's
No,
what
not at all.
Arcides finds, but that's not what Josephus says.
Oh.
Like you said,
His
the last
part-
3, sorry.
Yes, exactly. Go ahead, David.
The last 3 lines are Josephus's opinion, that if you're not passionate about this, if you take it at face value, it's quite meritorious. It's great honor to Shabbat and to God to give your life rather than break Shabbat. He's
Exactly.
not necessarily saying that he favors that, but you'd have to believe he does if he brings it up.
Right. And I think there are some conflicting views a little bit later on in Josephus's writings, but clearly he says here it's meritorious, something that would probably come as a surprise to us that someone would have said 2nd century BCE, remember pre-rabbinic, that it's meritorious. Okay, so let's go to the last paragraph of text 6. And this is the whole first 2 paragraphs come with a like in the previous text, a massacre of Jews who wouldn't defend themselves on Shabbat. But this text comes from Maccabees, right? Comes from Maccabees, which basically, the book covers the Maccabean revolt through the dedication of the temple. And of course, that's also not part of the Tanakh, but thanks to Christian monks and others was canonized and part of Christian literature. And that's how we know the history of Hanukkah, because we don't see that in rabbinic literature, rabbinic writing. So let's just read this last paragraph. Tell me, maybe something you might have expected that was missing from this statement, because clearly Mattathias is going to have a different view than that we just heard in Jubilee. So what is Mattathias's concern here? So short, that last paragraph, when the news, someone want to read it?
I'll read it.
Okay.
When the news reached Mattathias and his friends, they were deeply grieved over the victim's fate. They said to one another, if we all do as our brothers have done and do not fight against the Gentiles for our lives and our laws, they will now quickly wipe us off the face of the earth. On that day, they came to a decision. If any man comes against us in battle on the Sabbath day, we shall fight against him and not all die as our brothers died in their hiding places.
Okay, so his concern is,
They'll be wiped out off the face of the earth.
right, so this is an existential threat to the Jews whose only home was there. Remember, this is where the temple was and the center of the Jewish universe. And therefore it's an existential threat, but it was radical for its time, unlike the way we think today, right? Who's missing in here though?
Who's missing?
What is he not doing? It says, on that day, they came to a decision.
They didn't look at the Torah.
Or
Right, so
God.
here we learn all this, that God will be with us when we go out to battle. It doesn't seem that they dealt with a theological issue, right? Of, we're trying to keep, the Jews alive and therefore God will be with us. There's none of that like there normally is in the other places. They came to a decision, right? They decided that this existential threat would overrule, in a sense, the prospect of losing their lives, right? Someone would say that he was flouting God's will. He might say God would not want the Jews to die. God gave us the Torah, etc. Would not want that to happen to us. Okay, so let's go to number 12. Sorry, I got it wrong. Well, we're not going to do that one, but it's another quote from Jewish Antiquities from Josephus. And actually I want to do it. So it's the last two paragraphs of number 12. There you go. But if it were the national custom, someone wanted to read it and decide, Mattathias made a decision, right? So see how they interpreted that decision.
We're not.
Okay, but if it were not our national custom to rest on the Sabbath day, the earthworks would not have been finished because the Jews would
Earthworks
have
are,
prevented.
earthworks were, I think it may have said it there, but it's sort of an artificial bank or a mound used as a fortification that you could build up sort of in laying siege. Okay, go ahead, sorry.
Okay, because the Jews would have
We know what
prevented.
earthworks are.
For the law permits us to defend ourselves
We know.
against those who begin a battle and strike us, but it does not allow us to fight against an enemy that does anything else. Of this fact, the Romans were well aware, and on those days which we call the Sabbath, they did not shoot at the Jews or meet them in hand-to-hand combat, but instead they raised earthworks and towers and brought up their siege engines in order that these might be put to work the following day.
Okay,
That was very nice
interesting.
of the Romans to do that.
Well, no, it wasn't that it was nice. It was actually crafty of the Romans, because the Romans knew already of Mattathias's decision to fight if attacked, right? So they didn't want to necessarily attack them and lose people, as it says, to meet them in hand-to-hand combat. So what did they do? They used it to prepare, because they knew that at that time, at least, it was interpreted that only if someone attacks us can we respond, in a sense, which is a much narrower interpretation of what Mattathias did, Matityahu did. So what's interesting is that we take that decision and see he didn't call on God. He made the decision as part of the Hanukkah story to to be willing to defend himself, but they even narrowed it, the people of Jerusalem, allowing only defensive response to warfare, but not doing anything else. Okay, so eventually, and this was partially in the video, we had the concepts that evolved of what's called milchemet chovah, an obligatory war, milchama. One could always think about, the Yom Kippur War, right, as was used as an example. A milchemet chovah, right? You have to fight that war. Versus a milchemet reshut, which means an optional war, right? Not a response to immediate existential threat, but even a means of achieving long-range goals of enhanced security, right? This concept that was allowed in rabbinic tradition, a more expansive approach, just as an aside, as I think was mentioned in the video, is really important today for observant Israelis serving in the IDF, because without doing that, the soldiers would have to ask themselves all along the way whether they were permitted to engage in any particular action on Shabbat if it falls within that category. And they don't have to, because they're told that, ultimately everything they do is in preparation of the existential dangers that Israel faces from its enemies. So we're going to go to the last text here, number 16. I should, this is from Mishnah Yoma. So already we're now talking about the Mishnah. When we were studying Jubilees and Josephus and those texts, that was 2nd century BCE. We're now the Mishnah, which was codified around 200 of the Common Era. But the literature can be anywhere in the 1st or 2nd centuries. And you'll tell me what we're going to see. So let's have someone read that text. Someone want to volunteer that hasn't read?
I'll read.
Okay.
Moreover, Rabbi Mattia ben Harash said, if a person has throat pain, they may drop medicine into the person's mouth on Shabbat, since a person's life may be in danger. And whenever a person's life may be in danger, even if it is not definitely, but only potentially in danger, this overrides the prohibitions of Shabbat.
So what do we make of this Mishnah?
Saving a life is prevalent.
Right. So already by the 2nd century of the Common Era, just a few hundred years later, there's been almost a radical shift from Shabbat and you shall die. Now, granted, the rabbis found all kinds of ways of being able to modify those initial beliefs about Shabbat, but clearly they modified for the need of the times that they were living in all the way through. And all of a sudden then in rabbinic literature, pikuach nefesh, saving a life, took on preeminence and pretty much has remained so. This is a little bit confusing because, believe it or not, before rabbinic commentary was there, you weren't allowed to give somebody medicine on Shabbat. You weren't allowed to have someone come and give you medicine on Shabbat. So this was a rabbinic innovation that even if they have throat pain, they can drop the medicine in because pikuach nefesh, and even if it isn't pikuach nefesh, doche Shabbat, it pushes off Shabbat. So we have really, if we just go over the course of from the Bible to the 2nd century BCE to the 2nd century CE, a shift in the way that Shabbat had preeminent value, having kept the Jews, but modifications that began to be made in the time of Matityahu, right, in the book of Maccabees and other things. And even that wasn't interpreted until rabbinic times a little more liberally, to where pikuach nefesh, saving a life, would take preeminence. Okay, so we can turn the text off. All right, so it was in 1958 that Rabbi Mordechai Waxman, alav shalom, wrote what really was the first book to for modern consumption, mid-20th century consumption, on the meaning and the philosophy of the conservative movement. And the name of that book was, anybody know? Nobody? When I say it, you might remember. Okay.
Observant life.
Tradition and change.
What?
What did you say?
Tradition and
Observant
change.
life.
Exactly. So there have been many new slogans to describe the conservative movement, but when the conservative movement was booming in the 50s, it was the largest movement, and synagogues were being built, including Beth Israel and many others. It was the first book to come out that would balance as close as possible the philosophy. It really was never narrowed down and printed until the 80s, when the conservative movement really put out a belief system of various philosophical beliefs and the wide variety of beliefs in the conservative movement. But it was called Tradition and Change. And that was, and still remains, even though the slogans may change, the motto and the essence of the conservative movement. Mm-hmm. That we have respect for tradition. Tradition is what guides us. Tradition is what keeps us together as Jews, which includes Shabbat and holidays and kashrut and all those things that are part of tradition and all of those values. And yet we recognize that changes have been made. We saw that just alone in the what we saw from the Torah to the 2nd century BCE, to just one smidgen of change when it came to pikuach nefesh becoming preeminent as a value. So when the question is how we should think about change, right? So when we think about change, and I'm going to give you 3 categories, and then we'll sort of talk about them a little bit in the context of examples. When we think about change, do we think about authenticity? Authenticity, meaning the authority of those making the change, the rabbis, the Beit Din, the rabbis of the Mishnah, the Talmud, and contemporary rabbis of today to some extent, and whether, as they go through their legal response, the rationale is convincing, or whether it was sufficiently grounded in Jewish text. So when we think about tradition and change, is that a preeminent value for you? Authenticity, right? Who has the ability to be able to do that, to write the responses, etc. Second thing, content, i.e., whether there is a genuine need for change in a practice or a belief. Is there a need? Is this a critical need for a change in practice or belief? And finally, context and consequences, i.e., the context and the consequences of really feeling that we're at a pivotal moment in Jewish history. I would say that for example, many of the decisions that were made by me and by the synagogue and by the conservative movement as the pandemic began was not just to talk about pikuach nefesh, which of course we did, but in having to make the different changes, we often use the term that I taught and spoke about, that we are in a sha'at dechak. It's a pivotal moment in Jewish history. It's a pressing moment that we in our lives have never experienced before, but Jews have, going back to the Middle Ages and other times with pandemics. And so they knew that things were put aside. Now, put aside doesn't necessarily mean that's the way it continues forever, just because you've put those things aside, but there is a recognition, again, with pikuach nefesh and sha'at dechak. Okay, so let's talk about a couple questions in the context of authenticity, right? Whether that matters to you, those who are making the change, and is it grounded in Jewish texts when changes are made? Whether there's a content issue here, there's a genuine need for a change in a practice or a belief, and it could be societal, it could be changes, or is it context and the consequences, really a pivotal moment? So the first question I want you to think about just for a moment is, think about your own approach to change when it comes to Judaism. I mean, you could think about it broadly in your life, and hopefully they will be parallel, but sometimes people are more protective of their Jewish beliefs or the ways they were raised. Do you experience change as something negative? And by negative, I mean that suggests decline or greater inauthenticity, right? There are people, for example, who are not religious in the least, right? But will only go to Chabad because and for many reasons they may go, but one of the reasons is that the rabbis look very authentic, as one would imagine, all the pictures and the black hat and the payas and even though they're not observant, that's the authentic Judaism. A lot of Israelis were like that, right? Very hesitant to be a part of the Masorti movement and other movements. If they had to go to a shul, they would go to an Orthodox shul. They don't go to shul, but if they had to, they would go. So do you experience change as something negative, decline, or something positive?
Well,
does it depend on what's being changed or when the change takes place? Yes, Edie. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
Edie.
We recently experienced change in the congregation when you spoke to us about eating rice
Right.
Passover. And I remember you're citing that the reason the Ashkenazi Jews began not eating legumes or whatever was because one and only one Eastern European rabbi said we shouldn't, but yet nobody else did.
Well,
So
that one person was pretty important in the Shulchan Aruch, but that said it. But the truth, the reason really was again being very restrictive. So it's a good example because the Ashkenazim lived in places where corn could be mixed with grain, and therefore they were worried, and therefore they prohibited it. Whereas the Sfaradim weren't in countries that had the same worries, and the Sfaradim didn't. And therefore the question is, can we change today when we don't have those worries anymore? So, you know, we don't live in a place where we're worried about wheat being mixed with rice that is not considered to be chametz. On the other hand, I can tell you, we don't eat it in our house because the ba'alat habayit, because my wife is in charge of the kitchen and she won't eat legumes. So there's an example where one doesn't. Anyone else though about? I mean, what do you think? Is change related in your mind to inauthenticity? Is change positive? Does it depend on what?
I'd like to say something about change. I grew up Reform and then became conservative, but been to several synagogues. And what bothered me most was the change in the ritual, the music, the different things the rabbi did, or something like that. But I felt that when I went to synagogue, and I was disappointed that they didn't sing the same songs I used to, and stuff like that.
Okay, so I thank you for bringing that up, because that's one of the things I always get is when people say, "Oh, you're saying that can't we use the traditional Adon Olam? Why do you have to do a different Adon Olam?" And my answer often is, "Well, which Adon Olam do you like?" And they say, Adon Olam, whatever one they say. And I say, you realize that originated as a beer song in Germany that they took, and that became, it's inviolate. It's Torah mi Sinai from Sinai. Okay, so I just want to read what was put into the Zoom. How did you make the decision to allow Zoom services on Shabbat? Was that a responsa decision for the conservative movement? Well, so again, that clearly would fall into the context and consequences part of changing Jewish tradition, because as you remember, it was extremely radical that there were Orthodox rabbis that first Passover, not this year, that first Passover, that allowed people to turn on their computers and keep them on. So the conservative movement, again, did highlight all of those things, but especially the principle of b'sha'at dechak, in pressing consequential circumstances, which is not the same necessarily as a natural evolution of Jewish traditions that might carry on and take place. But we know that, when I was studying Gittin and learning how to write Jewish bills of divorce, and I read some of the literature during the Shoah, that they violated all and many of the very strict ways that Gittin have to be done, because it was sha'at dechak. And the strictest rules around any life cycle that happens in Judaism is Gittin, is divorce, because you don't fool around with divorce, because it can have dire consequences for the future of the wife and the family. And yet they overruled the rabbis, Orthodox rabbis. So yes, it was a responsa, but even within that responsa was, for example, you may not know this, but it was rabbis that got Zoom to change their policy of allowing Zoom to be on for 24 hours. Zoom, when Zoom first started and we all went on Zoom, it didn't exist for 24 hours. And it was rabbis that allowed that. But many synagogues have had many different decisions about Zoom that they've made, some which don't allow people to, which encourage people to turn on their Zoom ahead of time. The nature of the kinds of services and what's allowed during services. Do you run the service as a minyan, which we basically have been doing during this period, or do you not, as some synagogues haven't and don't do many of those elements? And as someone else said, we were given the allowance to be able to use electronics, but there were still a lot of people that weren't comfortable in doing so. Okay. So let me segue, because I don't want to go too much longer, another 10 minutes or so. Let me know if you have experienced a change in Jewish life that seemed very controversial, even alien at the time, but now feels normal and authentic to you. And why do you think your experience of it changed? A change in life that seemed controversial, seemed alien, but now just feels normal and authentic. And why did your experience of it change?
I would say allowing the Christian parent to come up to the bima during a bat mitzvah.
Okay, so exactly. So that's part of the positive challenge of Keruv, and the fact that the conservative movement and others have have reached out to be welcoming of all families of every kind. And if we're asking them to belong to the synagogue and to come, what ritual things can they be allowed to do and what ritual things can they not? And it's only since I've been at Beth Israel that we've allowed the non-Jewish partner to be up there when their child reads from the Sefer Torah and to do a parent's prayer and other things. Okay. So why do you think your experience of it changed, though, David?
Why I'm not sure I understand, because at one time we didn't do it. Now we do it. It's a change.
Well, but I'm talking about—
It's comfortable now.
Okay, so part of it is you become used to it. But the question was, everybody here, if you can share something personal, right, that changed, that seemed to you controversial or alien to you, and that now seems normal.
This isn't very important things, but I've always felt for a long time that a lot of the Christian traditions have filtered into the Jewish life, baby naming parties. Where before, I know when my kids were born, my aunt went to shul and had them named, the girls. Also baby showers, things we never—
Right, but that's not—
that's the
okay.
Superstition, I realize.
Right, but that's not necessarily Jewish, right? But what I will tell you is there are many traditions before the modern Simchat Bat, like Zeved Bat, a Sephardic tradition, huge celebration.
Which is what?
In the Sephardic world.
Zavat Habat.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct. So, and Amy typed in wearing a talit. There are many here that wear a talit in synagogue. And, I've had personal discussions with some of you over the years about wearing a talit. And now if people don't wear it every week, but even are used to wearing it, I no longer have to explain it to everybody when I tell them about it. It's become norm, right? And tefillin as well, as Valerie had said. Well, all of egalitarianism is something that we've gotten used to, right? There used to be a decent number of synagogues in the conservative movement that were not egalitarian. There are very few of them, right? So Howard, express what you just said. Say it out loud with an example. Howard Burkham.
Oh, me. I think I just unmuted, and you were talking before about the reason for eating or not eating rice on Pesach, and I was extending that to other of the laws of kashrut that have, I think, pretty evident explanations in terms of public health and what was available when those laws first came to be. And so the question is, when what seems like the evident reason for a prohibition goes away, it must depend, but are you still obligated to follow it even when there's not a clear reason? And
Okay.
This goes to your question of authority or authenticity.
Authority and community practice, because if you go back to the Torah, the class I taught last year at Tikkun Leil Shavuot was on minhagim, right? Because a lot of what we think is law are customs, but many of those customs became minhag halacha, became Jewish law, like, or the concept of minhag avotenu biyadenu, the minhag that's of our forefathers from thousands of years ago, we can't overrule. So the example would be, right, why don't we in the conservative movement have one day of Yontif, the first and last days of Pesach and Sukkot? And there was a responsa in the 50s that permitted that to be done in the context of community. And interestingly, that's a custom where, even though one could argue, we know the calculation, inculcation of the calendar very well. And yet, because it's a custom that has been with us for thousands of years, Jews in the diaspora observe 2 days, even though the reason no longer exists, because we do know the calendar. anyone else about a change in Jewish life that was controversial, alien. I can tell you for myself, I remember back 30 some odd years ago being asked as a rabbi if I would officiate at a gay, well, there wasn't such a thing as a gay wedding. There was only a commitment ceremonies. And I said, I absolutely would marry two gay people as long as one was male and one was female. It was 35 years ago, right? And then I taught a course in homosexuality in Judaism, a rabbi's view from the middle at the Adult Institute, which clearly showed that there was a change in attitudes because I had 90 or 100 people at the Adult Institute, and then the second one even more. And then our societal changes made it such that I found an irony when Rabbi Berger came here, who was more religiously traditional than I was, but of a younger generation, and he was more willing to do a commitment ceremony and a marriage of two gay Jews than I was. And I, I have expressed my willingness to do the wedding of two Jews who are gay, and I hope still in my lifetime maybe to be able to do that. Okay, so that sort of leads me to the conundrum and issues that we'll be facing, and I don't have answers to this.
No.
What?
Where is he?
Oh. Okay, thank you. I don't have answers to this yet, but given the context of what we talked about, these are issues that we're going to be facing. You know, before the pandemic started, there's a phrase that has been bandied about for 20 or so years in saying that the Jewish community has an edifice complex. All right, an edifice complex. We built these grand institutions, these big buildings for Jewish organizations, and there was a trend over the last 20 years of the importance of being outside the synagogue walls, having programs outside the synagogue walls. Well, guess what? We've had our pandemic, we're in our pandemic, and virtually, you know, everything is virtual until next week, but everything is virtual. But when I say until next week, we've also recognized and put in new technology so that there'll still be Zoom and a better experience for people coming in. But that comes with a lot of questions, right? It comes with the questions of balancing values and things that we think are important in our tradition. Beit Knesset is important. We know how important it is for most of you who come to synagogue, who have missed just being in a congregation together in the sanctuary on Shabbat, experiencing it, the Torah, you know, I come to synagogue to talk to God, and so comes to synagogue to talk to that person who wants to talk to God, right? So for all the different reasons, for social reasons, for religious reasons, for spiritual reasons, we miss community, and we're balancing the virtual, which is necessary, with the question for how long. And if we've done things under the rubric of b'sha'at dechak, that it's no longer pikuach nefesh at some point, it's b'sha'at dechak. These pressing circumstances are a way to do the things like assuming that if we were to do Mariv service right now, we'd have a minyan, we do Baruch Hu. But do we require a minyan, which is a cornerstone of Jewish belief? Personally, as I've said to a few people, I would not want to yes, I saw what you wrote, Howard, thank you. But the attitudes of people changed very quickly, is the point. The minyan, the issue of minyan you're balancing a community coming together, a concept not as important as Shabbat, but as old as Shabbat. The very first thing that people did in rabbinic times that you're told is to, find a place to bury, establish a Chevra Kadisha, and have a synagogue where people can come and where you can have a minyan of people. And now you have virtual life, which is not the same pre-pandemic as it will be post-pandemic. And how are we going to balance those needs of people, of course, of people who can't come, who physically are unable to come, but of people who may be uncomfortable for a long period. And how do we balance that? And by the way, I don't have an answer for that. There are still elements of our reemergence 6 months or 8 months down the road that I'm not sure of. And that's why we're starting very slowly. We're incorporating newer technology in the sanctuary. But for example, on Shabbat morning, I made the decision that we're not going to any longer have virtual reading from a Chumash from people's homes and have that coming into the sanctuary. The reading from the Sefer Torah and Aliyot and everything will take place in the sanctuary. That's a decision that holds to the importance of synagogue and minyan and reading from the Sefer Torah. There were synagogues who, when we read from the Sefer Torah, who did not allow Aliyot to be read on Zoom over the last year and a half. They just said the blessing La'asok b'divrei Torah, as if you're studying Torah, but not Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim, because we weren't reading from the Torah itself. Okay, so we know, right? Going back to the text for a moment, that the Hasidians, when I started out, Hasidians felt that to compromise on Shabbat was to transform Judaism beyond recognition. To Mattityahu and the Maccabees, the Hasidians were putting Judaism in peril, for without Jews, right? And this is in a contemporary way too, there is no Judaism. And the most I think that we can share together in coming out of this is that when there is a question as paramount as the future of Judaism and Jewish life, it's important to listen to the both sides. We're a community of both sides. We do have people for whom tradition is preeminent and who are more hesitant for change, and that needs to be respected. People who want to err on the side of tradition, of the famous book, Tradition and Change. And then we have those who want to err on the side of change. And our obligation is to strive to understand those arguments as another one of what we studied, give respect to them in their full complexity, and then figure out what works best when it comes to the decision-making in a congregation and who makes the decisions, which is one of the other classes, not for tonight, as well as the needs of the community going forward. So I'm just about 5 minutes later than I wanted. So thank you everybody for joining and for sharing tonight, participating. And hopefully I'll see you next week, 7 p.m., same time, same place.